afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Finding the Fountain of Youth, The Truth Behind the Myth with author Rick Kilby. I'm Katie Kelly. I'm the Special Programs Coordinator here at the Orange County Regional History Center. I'll share a little bit of information about our organization for anyone who may be attending a Lunch and Learn for the first time. The History Center is located in downtown Orlando, and we offer 3 floors of permanent exhibitions, renowned special exhibitions from the Smithsonian, and a variety of interactive, unique experiences and programs for guests of all ages. While the History Center is partially funded by Orange County, donations to the Historical Society of Central Florida are vitally important to the center's ability to serve the community and continue to fulfill our mission to serve as the gateway for community engagement, education, and inspiration by preserving and sharing Central Florida's continually unfolding story. Donations allow for the care and upkeep of the historic collection, presentation of special exhibitions, and offering innovative programming. If you want to learn more about how to support the History Center in a variety of ways, you can visit us at thehistorycenter.org. Today's program is being facilitated as a webinar, so that means that attendees do not have access to your video and audio. We will save some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to put any questions that you have for our presenter in the chat as they come up, and we'll address those at the end. So without any further ado, I'm happy to introduce today's presenter. Orlando-based writer and graphic designer Rick Kilby is the author of Florida's Healing Waters, Gilded Age Mineral Springs, Seaside Resorts, and Health Spas, which received the Silver Medal for Florida Nonfiction from the Florida Book Awards and the Florida Historical Society's Stetson Kennedy Award. His first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, Ponce de León and Florida's Magical Waters, won a Florida Book Award in Visual Arts category. He's contributed articles to the Florida Humanities Forum magazine and the Society for Commercial Archaeology's Journal, and is the designer and managing editor of the History Center's award-winning historical journal, Reflections from Central Florida. So without any further ado, Rick, please take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Katie. It's a pleasure to be here. I make a living as a graphic designer, and I've worked for the History Center for over 20 years, actually. And that really informed my writing. I learned a lot of history through the work I was doing for the History Center, but I also come at writing from a graphic design type of approach, so that all my books are very visually oriented, and I learn a lot from looking at the imagery, and they're constructed in a way that takes advantage of the imagery. So before I do some myth busting with the myth of the Fountain of Youth, I want to talk to you first about how I got started on this odyssey myself of finding the Fountain of Youth. This is the book cover that my book that came out in 2013. But my journey actually starts much earlier in 2002 when of all the strange places, in Reno, Nevada, because I went to a conference of an organization called the Society for Commercial Archaeology. And those are people who love everything connected to the commercial American roadside. So we're talking neon signs, old diners, drive-ins, and old roadside attractions. And what that did is it shifted the way I looked at Florida. So when I came back to Florida, I started to not overlook things that in the past I thought might be too kitschy and campy, and see value in them. So when I saw a picture of this vignette from the Fountain of Youth attraction in St. Augustine, I made it my mission to visit it. And I think I got there in 2006 for the first time. I love this mannequin of Ponce with the puffy pants, and there's actually a little roller back there that spins with the water on it. I love that. I think graphic designers tend to love campy, kitschy kind of stuff. But why I was hesitant to go there until I was an adult was that my father taught me, as a Floridian, you don't go to places like that. These are tourist traps. They just want to take your money. These are for the tourists. As a Floridian, we don't spend our money on that because they just want your dollar. When I went to this place, I fell in love with it. It not only is it a remarkable piece of property, jutting into the water in St. Augustine, full of great things to see, like this campy vignette, but this historical sign out front has this important sentence at the very end. There may be no other single property in Florida that contains such an array of important archaeological resources for our state's early history. And I had almost totally overlooked it because I was still in the mindset that these were tacky tourist traps. Because when Pedro Menendez established the first European settlement, continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States, in St. Augustine, in 1565, he did it on that property that is now the Fountain of Youth. I always like to joke about this postcard is the guy has a map there and he's looking for where to put the Wawa, or maybe they're building condos. But when Menendez landed, he was attracted to that site because it was the ancient Timucuan village of Saloy. And he built his original settlement between two shell mounds. And if you know about the indigenous people, shell mounds there were several different varieties. Some were for burial, some were for religious purposes, and some were just kind of garbage disposal places. But there was two of them, and they put the original settlement right there. And there's an archaeologist at the University of Florida named Kathleen Deegan who does digs, or used to do digs there every summer. And you can see this is a dig they're doing on the grounds of the Fountain of Youth. It started as an attraction right around the turn of the century. It's possible that the person who owned it before this individual, whose name is Diamond Lil, also sold drinks of water there at some small spring that was located on the property. But it really became a roadside attraction because of this individual, who's fascinating. Her life is so full of lies and mistruths and reinventing herself. It's really hard to know what the truth is. She goes by several names. At this point, she was going by Luella Day. She also goes by Luella Day McConnell. She also goes by Diamond Lil. She got her medical degree supposedly from the University of Iowa, practiced medicine in Chicago, but then had to leave Chicago, and she went to Alaska and Yukon Territory during the gold rush. And all these misadventures happened. She thought she was being framed by the Canadian government. She had to leave, and somehow she ended up in St. Augustine. And that's where our story starts. And there are all these stories that she had a diamond in her front tooth is one of the stories, that she bought the property for the Fountain of Youth with a bag of diamonds. I'm not sure if any of it's true. Look at this thing in the beginning of her book about her Yukon adventures. Nothing in the book is false or exaggerated. If you have to put that at the beginning of your book, it's likely that everything is false or exaggerated. The story, as she told it, was that she had some workers remove a tree, and all of a sudden, underneath where the tree was, a spring sprouted up. And they dug a little bit deeper, and she found a stone cross with 15 stones going one direction and 13 stones in the other, indicating the year 1513. And as they dug further, they found this vessel for salt with Spaniards or conquistadors etched on the side, and inside was a parchment that talked about Ponce de León and the Fountain of Youth. And she supposedly went to Spain, had it dated, and in her mind, this showed that this was the legendary Fountain of Youth that supposedly Ponce de León sought. And so she opened up a tourist attraction, and you could go there and drink the water, and people have been paying through the nose to drink the stinky water there ever since. It's unlikely there was ever a natural spring there. It's more likely that it was a well dug sometime. Luella ran it for a couple of decades, and then she died tragically in a car accident. And then the Fraser family stepped in. Walter Fraser was a state senator and a real pioneer in developing tourism in St. Augustine. And the Fraser family still owns it today. They made it a full-on attraction. You can see some of the things here in the sign: historic space globe, planetarium, and an Indian burial ground. Fortunately, the Native American remains have been reinterred. But it's still open today. If we were in person, I'd ask who's been there. I highly recommend it. They've done a great job, and they have put money into the park and are really more into history now than they are in perpetuating the myth, although this sign is probably inaccurate. Turns out I had been there before. At some point, my father wasn't so cheap that he couldn't spend a couple bucks to go to the Fountain of Youth. That's me on the right, I think in 1967, or maybe it's me after I drank too much of the water. And the same statue is there today. But that one trip to the Fountain of Youth kind of changed my whole life, because I left that point of view of being a jaded Floridian and these are tourist traps, just want to take your money, to what have I missed that I've taken for granted in our state before in the past. But I was particularly obsessed with Ponce de León and the Fountain of Youth. At one point in our state's history, mostly in maybe the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Ponce was like an unpaid celebrity endorser, and you found his likeness all over the state. You found Ponce de León hotels and motels. You found Ponce streets. You found anything you put his name on. You did, because you didn't have to pay him any royalties. So I started looking for those, because as we got later into the 20th century, we started to understand better the effect of the Europeans in Florida had on the indigenous people already living here. So he fell out of favor. So what I was looking for were vestiges of the past when Ponce was everywhere. And I called it Ponceabilia. And I was on a search for Ponceabilia. So in St. Augustine, you don't have to go far. From the Fountain of Youth, you just have to go to the Wax Museum. And there's Ponce made out of wax with his buddy Menendez just hanging out. Then you go down to the waterfront. There's a big flagpole right by the Bridge of Lions. It says discovered 1513 by Ponce de León. Then if you go down US 1, the mall is named after Ponce de León. It's everywhere. And this kind of fed my enthusiasm. So I started looking for and searching more. I learned there was not only one, but two Fountain of Youth attractions in St. Augustine. The second one, which was opened before Diamond Lil ever got there, was created by a guy named John Whitney, who was the grandson of Eli Whitney, the famous guy who invented the cotton gin. And he was a real estate developer in St. Augustine, and he needed something to get people kind of off the beaten track to where he was selling lots to build houses. It's called Ravenswood, and it's on the other side of that water. I guess it's a bay, just northwest of US 1. And so there was a little spring there, and he created a Fountain of Youth attraction. And you can see, he said the water there had iron and iodine and other medicinal properties, and that it would make you feel better. So I think he charged a nickel a piece, and people would come there and go to that little tower and drink the water. But he was really trying to sell houses more than anything else. But there was another Fountain of Youth, and this one has a very interesting story on the other side of the state in St. Petersburg. One of the pioneers of St. Petersburg was a guy named E.H. Tomlinson, and he loved to fish. And so he built this very long pier out into Tampa Bay. And so long, if you caught fish, it would be a real drag to have to drag them all the way back down the pier. So he made it long enough and wide enough so you could drive a car and turn around and come back. And at some point, he decided to make it even more convenient. He dug a well so you could clean the fish at the end of the pier. When he dug the well, he noticed it reeked of sulfur, and that back in the 19th century, sulfur water was seen as healthful and an opportunity to open a spa or some place where people could take the waters. So he sold it to a guy named Conrad, and he built, you can see the little sign, it says, something salt and sulfur baths Fountain of Youth, and he dubbed it the Fountain of Youth, and people would go out there and drink the water. And it lasted for decades. Of course, being out in the middle of Tampa Bay, it was suspect to hurricanes, and so it got wiped out by a hurricane. So they drilled a new well on land, and then the city ended up owning it and moving it around. But you can see, this is probably from the 1940s, people really believed in the power of the water. And they found later it had a high amount of lithium. And lithium is something that is supposed to alter your mood. You know, people take lithium for different health issues. And that was one of the things that was in the water there. And I guess it helps your eyes and your feet. And the fountain that they drilled on land, the well that the city owned, is still there near Outlying Field. In this corner of this parking lot, there's a water fountain there. So that's one of the Fountains of Youth that still exists today. There's another one in Punta Gorda or Punta Gorda. Punta Gorda has a long history with Ponce de León. It's possible that that could be the site where he met his untimely end. But during the 1920s, there was a big real estate boom in Florida, and they built this fountain. They dug a well, built this fountain, and they tiled it with ships and everything and called it the Fountain of Youth. And people loved the water there. There was an article about this on the National Geographic website just a few years ago. People will come in and fill their water and let it dissipate, because if they don't, they could get radiation poisoning. If you notice the sign, it says that this water is radioactive. It's naturally radioactive, but if you don't let it sit out, you might get too much radiation. And people still prefer that water to the regular municipal water that they have in Punta Gorda. Ultimately, I found that many of the springs throughout the state, and we have over 1,000 springs, if they were commercially developed at some point or another, tended to rely on the myth of the Fountain of Youth. I've been in advertising most of my adult life, and I know that it's kind of an easy thing to glom onto something like a myth where people love the story behind it. So this is War Mineral Springs. They claim to be the original Fountain of Youth. It's a wonderful place. I could do a whole talk just about that. This one's right here by us. This is Ponce de León Springs in Volusia County, the place where you get the pancakes. There's actually two Ponce de León Springs. The other one is up in the Panhandle. But this one was called Spring Garden Springs. They rebranded it to take advantage of the myth of the Fountain of Youth. This is another one, Wakulla Springs, another fascinating story. That's where they filmed Creature from the Black Lagoon. If you saw Lou Vickers talk, she talked about Wakulla Springs. It was owned by a guy named Ed Ball. He claimed that Ponce came there not only once, but twice, and he had the arrowhead that killed Ponce, which is a fabrication and a lie. There's no evidence that Ponce came anywhere near Wakulla Springs, although he might have. We just don't know. This is another one in Pinellas County. It's a county park today called Wall Springs. You can see they also called it Health Springs and Lithia Springs at different times. Springs often change names in order to take advantage of the Fountain of Youth or just to avoid confusion. There was a number of green springs. There still is a number of blue springs, and there was a number of white springs. And they all constantly changing names. But this one claimed to be the Fountain of Youth. Salt Springs in the Ocala National Forest could be the Fountain of Youth, and that's one that you can still visit today, and it's a very beautiful site. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, who, thanks to Pam Schwartz, the History Center, I now know is my fifth cousin 4 times removed, the famous writer who had a place in Mandarin, Florida, and wrote a book called Palmetto Leaves, encouraging people to immigrate down to Florida, wrote that the Fountain of Immortal Youth, which Ponce de León supposed was to be in the heart of Florida, could have been no other than Silver Spring. So Silver Springs was equated to be the Fountain of Youth. I think that most of the better known springs, at some point, someone says that could be the Fountain of Youth. And so with so many springs in Florida, it's natural that we would be the host of the Fountain of Youth. As time went on and my obsession grew, I noticed whenever I went to a new town, if I looked at the map, there was a Ponce de León Place, Avenue Street. I was very surprised when I found this practically in my own neighborhood, Ponce de León Place, right off Delaney, and it has a fountain on the sign. If you ever notice, our street signs in Orlando have a fountain on them. It's the Lake Eola fountain. But my obsession really got cranked up when I started going on eBay, which is it can be a very dangerous thing if you have collecting tendencies. And I want you to warn you against that, to be careful, because I went a little crazy and I probably had the world's largest collection of Poncabilia. This is one of my favorite pieces. This is a citrus label from Spain. I don't know why it has English in it, but Ponce finds the Fountain of Youth in orange juice. And it's interesting because the Spanish were the ones who brought citrus to Florida in the first place. And so there are tons of ads out there equating Florida orange juice with good health and making the connection to rejuvenation and the Fountain of Youth. But this graphically has to be my all-time favorite. This is a postcard that I really love because this is probably, judging from their outfits, maybe 1920s. They look like flappers to me, having a great time at the bar. There's Ponce with his Indian buddies, the La Florida bar, the Fountain of Eternal Youth. And this is a bar where Hemingway loved to hang out. And if you go to Cuba, it's still there today. Another one of my favorite images. And this was an ad. Ponce showed up in advertising in the early 20th century all over the place, but this is one of my favorites. Being chased by a pesky life insurance salesman who wants to sell him life insurance. And Ponce has no room for life insurance because he's going to find the Fountain of Youth and live forever. So he's running away from the life insurance salesman. So I found Ponce everywhere. My quest for Poncabilia was very rewarding, and it just made me want to learn more. So eventually I had to get into the hardcore history in order for my project to proceed. So let's do some myth busting. This is another one of my favorite images. This is a silk screen that's in the gift shop at the Fountain of Youth. I wish they would reproduce it again because it's such a great image. The legend is that Ponce came to Florida searching for the Fountain of Youth, got here in 1513 and stumbled across the state looking for this legendary spring. That that is really a myth. And as I learned in school, he landed in St. Augustine. I grew up in Gainesville. We go to St. Augustine every year, and it's carved in stone that the discoverer of Florida, Juan Ponce de León, landed near the spot in 1513, and they have a statue there. But there's some people who thinks he didn't land in St. Augustine because there's no archaeological evidence he landed in St. Augustine, none whatsoever. Nor is there any archaeological evidence of him setting foot anywhere in the state. They have not found any relics from his trip here. So there is an account that talks of him reaching latitude 30 degrees north in 8 minutes, 30 degrees, 8 minutes north, which is exactly about Ponte Vedra. So in 2013, we had the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Ponce de León in Florida. So there was a big quincentennial celebration. So there was a lot of competition for the official landing spot. So Ponte Vedra kind of threw their hat in the ring, and they actually had little bumper stickers, those little oval bumper stickers that said 30 degrees, 8 minutes north, because they believed, and they erected a statue right there with Ponce. So there's a lot of Ponce statues throughout the state. Another place that claims to be the landing site, and this is probably the furthest south, is Melbourne Beach. There was an amateur historian. He was a military guy named Douglas Peck, and he took into account the navigational errors that we knew the Spaniards would have made during that era, that there was flaws in their system. And he recreated the voyage in a comparable ship, and he landed in Melbourne Beach. And he says, and then he read the accounts about what they discovered the rest of the journey. You know, they found a bay here and an inland here, and it all matched up. So there are some contemporary historians, including the Michael Gannon, who's one of the best known Florida historians, who claim that he landed in Melbourne Beach. We don't know, but they erected a statue there in 2013 in time for the quincentennial. That's the first myth that I want to bust, that we don't know where he landed. The second myth is this. These are book covers. Ponce de León and the Discovery of Florida. 1513, Ponce de León discovers Florida. Ponce de León did not discover Florida. When he got here, the state was full of indigenous people. We don't know how many indigenous people. The number I like to throw out is about 1/3 I've heard numbers much higher than that. I've heard numbers low. I think I got that from Milanovic, who is one of the best experts in the indigenous people in our state's history. The fact is there's people here. Ponce de León didn't come here for the Fountain of Youth and discover the state. You can see from this map from the History Center, those are all names of different tribes of people. And you can find this in a interactive display on the History Center where the roots light up of all the Spaniards. But there's people all over the state. So there was nothing for him to discover. These people were already here. He was the first European to officially arrive here, and he may not have been the first European. There are maps that predate 1513 that showed the existence of Florida. So it's likely that different traders and slavers from Europe knew of the existence of Florida and may have landed there, but Ponce had the official charter, and I will talk about that in a minute. The people who he likely encountered first may have been the Timucuans, who lived north of Lake George in the central and northern parts of the state. We don't know exactly what they looked like. There was a guy named Lemoyne who was on one of the French expeditions. He lost his drawings, but tried to recreate them when he got back to France. So this is after Lemoyne. We do know that they likely were covered with tattoos because that's not part of the European tradition. We know for sure that the Timucuans did not look like this. They did not wear headdresses from the Plains Indians because that's totally inappropriate for what they look like. But this is how they were portrayed during the era when Poncebulia was crazy throughout the state. So this is an image, the black and white one from the Fountain of Youth. The lady is obviously white. She's wearing a Seminole dress and a Plains Indian headdress. It couldn't be more wrong. Of course, the sad thing is we know with the arrival of Ponce de León and the other Europeans that the indigenous people here had no resistance to disease. So ultimately that led to most of them being wiped out by the 1700s. There were some that were able to flee, and there were some that went back to Cuba, and there were some that intermarried with the people who would ultimately become the Seminole. But the Timucua and the Ice and the Calusa, all those people no longer exist because of the interactions with the Europeans. So in 2013, during the big quincentennial celebration, my brother and I went to Melbourne Beach, and they had a big event there where they had reenactors, and that's what you see on the bottom. But at the same time, there were protesters who wanted to point out the indigenous perspective. And it's very interesting to see the juxtaposition of these two points of view, because you know, that's the reality of how we're interpreting history in the 21st century. We know that these people brought with them the diseases and did things that would not be deemed appropriate. And it's a big, big topic. Another myth I want to bust is the myth, and I'll tell you how it was originally created, that Ponce de León came to Florida because he was in love with a younger woman, and he wanted to find the fountain of youth because, you know, he wanted to impress her. Here's what happened. Ponce de León got in a feud with Diego Columbus. This is a screenshot from a website called The Grudge, and I love this headline so much. And I will tell you now that what I know of the real story of Ponce de León, Juan Ponce de León. I don't pronounce it correctly because my Spanish is so poor. Ponce originally fought in the Spanish Wars against the Moors, and then he came with Christopher Columbus on his second voyage through the New World. And he landed in Hispaniola, did very well there. He was able to put down some of the rebellions of the indigenous people, and went to Puerto Rico, where he did very well again, became very wealthy, and was eventually made governor of Puerto Rico. Well, Diego Columbus, Christopher's son, took him to court and said, anything my father, Christopher Columbus, discovered, I have rights to govern. And he won in court. So all of a sudden, Ponce was thrown out without a job. So he petitioned the king for a royal charter, and the king said, you can go northwest of Puerto Rico, and we know there's a land there called Bimini. And you can, whatever you discover there, you can govern, you know, you can claim it for Spain, and you have the rights to do that officially. So in March of 1513, he took 3 ships and he sailed through the Bahamas, and he landed somewhere on the east coast of Florida, eventually sailed south down the coast, went through the Keys, then landed on the southwest coast. I've seen recent accounts that said it may not have been Charlotte Harbor. It may have been Tampa Bay, and actually near Santa Fe. Safety Harbor, but we don't know exactly where he landed. Some accounts say he may have gone as far as north as the Panhandle. Then he left and went back down to Cuba, and one of his ships split off and went back to and explored the Bahamas. We know that he met with indigenous people. They were not very happy to see him, so there were some violent interactions, especially in Southwest Florida. He came back in 1521. So this would be the 500th anniversary of his second voyage, and went straight to Southwest Florida. We're not sure why. I've heard stories that, you know, he saw gold because that's where the Calusa lived, and the Calusa traded with people who would have had territory where there's gold. I heard also that he saw them as a source of new free labor, because the Spanish enslaved indigenous people for labor for their plantations. And let's make it clear, Ponce de León was not looking for the fountain of youth. He was looking for gold, glory, and perhaps a new source of Indian slave labor, because the indigenous people of Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico were dying off at such a rate they needed more labor. Another interesting fact is that this is a black conquistador. He was originally born in Africa, but grew up in Spain. And the first free black person in the continental United States was with Ponce de León on both of his voyages to the New World. And on his second voyage to Florida in 1521, as soon as Ponce got there, they had violent interactions with the Calusa. Ponce was wounded with an arrow, and he died on the way back to Cuba. They just said, enough of this, because there was so much violence between the two peoples, and they went back, and Ponce died. His body was later reinterred in Puerto Rico. But despite the truth, the legend persists. This is a plaque in Miami that was rededicated in 1995, not that long ago, that says Ponce is looking for the fountain of youth. And it just goes on and on and on. I hear it constantly, the connection, because it's so ingrained in our consciousness. And I'd like to talk about the roots of the Fountain of Youth itself, the whole myth, because we are, as a species, we know of our own mortality. So to have this idea that we can live forever is universal. And to connect it with water, we are born from water, we evolved out of water. There are legends and myths and stories connecting water with eternal life in virtually every culture across the globe. So this idea that, I love this quote, this idea of hope can be traced throughout human history on all parts of the globe. This is a image from my book, and I talk about all the things that contributed to the Fountain of Youth and being connected with Ponce. On the left side, you have sacred rivers and healing and restorative rivers, which is the healing waters of Florida is the topic of my latest book. But I want to talk about the right-hand column. These cultural and stories that kind of embellish the facts so that by the time the myth was connected with Ponce, it was well known to people of Europe. It had been very well established. First, I want to talk about Gilgamesh, the oldest piece of literature in the world. He was a king in Mesopotamia, a fictional king. And if you've seen movies like Clash of the Titans, anytime in movies with Greek mythology or some kinds of mythologies where humans and gods interact, if you mess with the gods, they're going to get revenge. So he messed with the gods. And so they took out Gilgamesh, his best friend, his wingman, his buddy. They went on all these adventures. So all of a sudden, Gilgamesh was facing his own mortality. So he went on a quest to find something that would give him eternal life. And he heard about this plant under the water. And if you harvested the plant, you could have eternal life. So he goes down. I love the picture on the right. He's like Aquaman going down to the bottom, and he gets it. And he wants to share it with his family, because what good is eternal life if you have to do it with yourself? But before he can share with his family, the plant gets stolen from him. Another source of the myth of the Fountain of Youth is based on the stories of Alexander the Great. There is this version of his life called the Alexander Romances, which were fictional accounts based on his history that were very popular in the Arab world. And one of the stories in these Alexander Romances is a story of the Fountain of Youth. And you can see these Mideastern images where he is near the water seeking the Fountain of Youth or finding the Fountain of Youth. And these were very popular. The Bible has lots of stories of eternal water, baptism, the River Jordan. It's throughout the Bible. There are stories of the life-giving properties of water. And in some essence, water itself is a metaphor for life. But it's not just the Christian tradition, it's Hinduism as well. The Ganges River has the Kumbh Mela, which is the largest peaceful pilgrimage in the world. There's all these religious holidays where people come to the river because they believe in the purification qualities of the river, which is ironically one of the most polluted in the world these days. Another story, a legend that was well before Ponce de León, was the myth of Prester John. Prester John was a Christian king in a non-Christian world. And there's a great piece by Henry Louis Gates talking about how that story evolved. First, it was thought he was a king in India, and then later a king in Ethiopia. But what Henry Louis Gates points out is that when new lands were developed and there was all this mystery behind it, we tended to imprint our philosophy or our myths upon this unknown. And so when they were exploring Africa and it was, a big unknown, it's logical that they would take this myth of the Fountain of Youth and Eternal Waters and put it on this Prester John king, who supposedly not only had the Fountain of Youth, he also had a river of gold. So it's kind of showing that when there's a vacuum, people tend to fill it with ideas that they've had in the past. I love to see how the myth has evolved throughout art. So this is a piece from France from the 1300s, the early 1300s, carved stone. And you can see this kind of sets up how you will see the Fountain of Youth portrayed in art. It goes from the left to the right. You're older on the left and you're younger on the right. And there's also some amorous activity going on here. A lot of the imagery you see of the Fountain of Youth is related to rejuvenation and sexual potency, so that sometimes people emerge from the waters looking to hook up. I guess that's the best way I can say it. So you see things. This is a very famous painting by Louis Cranach from 1546. So this was 33 years or something after Ponce de León first came to Florida. You see people on the left there, they're old and they're decrepit, and wheelbarrows on leaders and wagons. They take off their clothes, jump in the water, then come out the other side, and they're ready to party. And so this is what you see again and again, left to right. This is a piece of sheet music from my own collection. Someday I want to find somebody who can play this. People old and decrepit walking along, go through the shower, and they're kids again, ready to party and have a good time. Of course, Florida, you have to have the Florida version. So this is a postcard, vintage postcard for the Fountain of Youth, the one promoting this talk. Lady in the wheelchair, puffy pants Ponce, fills her jug. Next thing you know, she's ready to hit the clubs at South Beach. Woohoo, party time. J. Michael Francis did a talk for the History Center a few years ago, and he's the preeminent scholar on Spanish Florida. And he just clearly said Ponce de León was never, ever searching for the Fountain of Youth. Here's how it got attached to him. First was Peter Martyr, and he was an Italian in the Spanish royal court. And this is a map from his book in 1511, so 3 years before Ponce came to Florida. You see in the circle, that is Cuba. To the right of that is Hispaniola. Above Cuba are some islands and some dotted lines. What is that landmass? What could it be? It's Florida. He wrote a story about the Fountain of Youth with no connection to Ponce de León. In fact, when he wrote it in 1514, he never even knew of Ponce de León. But you can see he wrote, in my first decades, which have been printed circulated, I have spoke of a fountain whose waters possess such an extraordinary hidden future that when old men bathe therein and drink thereof, they regain their youth. So 1514, no connection to Ponce de León. There is an idea out there in the Spanish court that there is a Fountain of Youth somewhere in the New World. So this is when it really happens. This is the first guy, Oviedo. He really had a bone to pick with Ponce because of the rivalry with Diego Columbus. And he wrote in his book, he wrote 15 books, and Oviedo actually traveled to the New World, that Ponce was dim-witted and dull, and these native people had this Fountain of Youth, and he was so gullible that he believed it, and he wandered around looking for it. And he really wrote poorly about him to make him look bad, to demean his manhood. In the Latin culture, that's one of the things that I hear that you can really do to put somebody down, is you demean their manhood. So he says that Ponce de León is so gullible and stupid, he's looking about to find the Fountain of Youth to regain his virility. Another account came from years later, 1575, by Escalante, who was actually captured by the indigenous people living here in Florida as a teenager and grew up with them. And so his account is one of the best resources we have today of what it was like in the 16th century in Florida. And he too wrote of Ponce, and I love the way he spelled Ponce with a Z, like the Pons. And he went to Florida in search of the River Jordan. He never calls it the Fountain of Youth, he calls it River Jordan. But again, years later, after Ponce has already started being slimed by Oviedo, and then it comes to Herrera. And Herrera, that's him in the upper right with the sour-looking face. He copied everybody. So when he wrote about the voyages of Ponce de León, he copied Oviedo and he copied the other guy. And so it's like telephone tag. Every version gets worse and worse and worse. So Ponce starts looking bad. And in people's consciousness, they really believe that he was this bumbling fool going across Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. It came into American consciousness thanks to Washington Irving. You know, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane, Rip Van Winkle. Washington Irving is the guy who wrote that in the Middle Ages, they believe the world is flat. And that's why Christopher Columbus came to the New World, which is not true. But that idea is so established in people's mind because they read it in Washington Irving, who wrote historical fiction. So he again took the Herrera account, made Ponce look even worse. And before you knew it, everybody in the United States believed Ponce de Leon was looking for the Fountain of Youth. So a few decades later, it becomes so popular that you can find this, which I always wonder what this is. Is it like steroids mixed with Kool-Aid? What could it be for $1 that would be the Fountain of Youth? It was everywhere. It became a cultural cliche. What I like to say is if there's a cartoon that's on TV long enough, eventually they're going to do a Fountain of Youth episode. So in 1953, Disney did a cartoon. You can find it on YouTube, Don's Fountain of Youth. Of course, Family Guy has to take a plug at the Fountain of Youth. Smurfs do it. There's stamps with Mickey Mouse in the Fountain of Youth. It's such a cliche in our culture that it's everywhere, and it's mostly attached to Florida. So let's talk about how different ways it's used in Florida. Henry Flagler came to the state at the late end of the 19th century to build hotels. His first hotel in St. Augustine, who did he name it after? Well, of course, Ponce de Leon, because he wanted to help cement the idea that Florida was a wonderful, restorative, rejuvenative place you came in winter. And he called it the Italy of America, and he did these wonderful, beautifully illustrated brochures enticing Northerners to come down in winter. And so Ponce de Leon is the perfect foil and the perfect name for this glorious hotel. And as a side note, if you haven't visited Flagler College and done their tour, you are missing out. It's incredible. So much of that wonderful Gilded Age stuff is on display, including the largest array of Tiffany glass in its original site anywhere, and that's in the dining room at Flagler College. Worth a visit. So in the 19th century and then in the early 20th century, Florida really starts promoting itself as it's this place of rejuvenation and restoration where you need to come and visit and to live here. So the Department of Agriculture starts advertising. And so what do? They talk about how wonderful the sunshine is, how healthy it is, and how they want to connect themselves to the idea that was put forward by Ponce de Leon. And it's not just restoration, rejuvenation, it's also recreating yourself. It's tabula rasa. You can be different in Florida. So you see ads again and again. Ponce de Leon had the right idea. Come to Florida, the Sunshine State. This is more of a mid-century one. A better life, man's oldest quest awaits your discovery in Florida. What her early discoverers sought is yours today in Florida. Again and again, they kept going back to the well. This is one of my favorite ads, though. Oh, well, no, not this one. This is one of my favorites, too. There is a Fountain of Youth in Florida. So this is, no subtlety to this. They're just saying there is a Fountain of Youth in Florida. It is Florida. It's the Sunshine State. But I love this because Thomas Edison is like a scientist. He's not going to say it's going to give you eternal life, but it might add 5 years to your life. So he's being very modest with his claims. But he jumped on board the bandwagon promoting Florida. But not just Florida. Cities within Florida started claiming to be the Fountain of Youth as well. St. Petersburg for a while took on the whole idea of being the health city. Later they switched to being the Sunshine City, but they called themselves the health city first because they wanted to perpetuate this idea that you come here, you live longer because you're healthier. Fort Lauderdale, they added 5 years to Thomas Edison's claim. You could add 10 years to your life in Fort Lauderdale. And Indrio, I like this community. I think it's near Fort Lauderdale. They have a little graph showing that you live longer when you come to Florida. And it worked. After World War II, Florida's population boomed. People came to places like Miami Beach. You saw these huge migration of senior citizens. And St. Petersburg, which got the reputation of God's waiting room. So you can see the demographics of the people here. And this is another one of my favorite images. Come to Florida. Why stay up north feeling half dead? You can be buried beautifully in sunny Florida for only $49.50. No more taxes, food, drinks, races, hotels, nightclubs, or doctor bills. And the people, this is all a gag, who put this out were supposedly stiff and deadly planning specialists for Northerners. So they're making light of this whole thing of older people coming here for a new life and actually dying in Florida because we had that reputation. Another one of my favorite images, I always like to joke, if you got the Fountain of Youth brew, it would be a hoppy IPA with a little bit of Geritol and maybe a little bit of sulfur in it. So this whole idea of coming to Florida and starting a new life continues to this day. This was 6 years ago when Florida eclipsed New York as the third largest state. We're second only to California and Texas, but we continue to grow because the idea that you can start afresh in Florida continues to be in people's consciousness. And one of the fastest growing areas in the country is, of course, the villages. And of course, ironically, one of the areas you can go to is called Spanish Springs, making a subtle attempt to say that they have the Fountain of Youth. So if you go to fountainofyouth.com, this whole idea of recreating yourself, you can get face lifts and neck lifts and all that kind of stuff. This is the fountainofyouth.com. And if you go to Melbourne, one of the spots where Ponce supposedly landed, you can go to the Fountain of Youth and get Botox and fillers. This connection with reinventing yourself, so strong in Florida. And of course, the connection with springs, this is Visit Florida, the state's website. It talks about the real fountains of youth, our springs. I do a lot of speaking about our springs and how they are impaired these days, but that's another talk. Nice plug, though. I'd like to plug that the Family Day is happening tomorrow at the History Center, where you could learn more about manatees for the whole kids. I'd like to close with this idea that myths are powerful and stories are fun, but the real history has much more complexity and is much more interesting than anything. And the danger of getting caught up in the myths is that you lose the real lessons of the history that can be learned and gleaned from. And it's a much duller story than the real truth. And I find this on social media where people cling to the idea that the Fountain of Youth is really in St. Augustine, or, I had somebody the other day saying it's really in Warm Mineral Springs. The reality is history is complicated. J. Michael Sands says it's messy. And if it's not messy, you're not doing it right. That's the end of my talk. And I'd love to see if anybody's got questions. I'm happy to answer.
So while we wait for, we have had some activity in the chat, but no specific questions yet.
Okay.
So I do have a question for you that I'm curious about while we wait for everybody to put their questions in. So how long was Florida tourism driven by the idea that a visit to Florida was healthful? Is it still, is Florida still promoted in that way? And why do you think that this myth has persisted for so long?
So one of the earliest accounts that I found in my latest book was the writer and transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson came to Florida in 1827. He was supposed to go only to Savannah, but for some reason he came down to St. Augustine. And by then, in the early 19th century, consumptives and other people who were invalids were already hanging out in St. Augustine because it was believed back then that being outdoors would help with consumption, so which is tuberculosis. So I think that really kind of the origins are really the 19th century because of the ability to be outside in winter, and that was so popular, and it just grew and grew and grew. And I think why it persists, and you still see it if you go to Visit Florida. There's all these wonderful images of people having all these wonderful outdoor activities. I think it's easy, it's an easy kind of marketing angle, but I also, the historian, whose name, Gary Mormino, says that the Fountain of Youth is Florida's foundation myth. Like everything is pinned on that one myth, and you could probably do a flow chart and everything is built upon it. Look at what's happened during the pandemic, the rush to get everything open again, because we really want people coming down to our state and being open and inviting people to come here and spend their money. Our economy is largely based on tourism to this day. And so, another thing I think contributed was that, we were kind of the Wild West of the East, that Florida really encouraged immigration after the Civil War, when people were, going out to Oregon and California and stuff. Florida was the least populated state east of the Mississippi. And because nobody had moved here, it was too hot and too miserable and swampy and all that stuff, that there was a rush to get people to move here. And, you saw different booms throughout Florida history. There was one at the end of the 19th century. There was one in the 1920s. And then there was one, I think the one after World War II never stopped except for the Great Recession, really. And that we're still kind of in that boom. And a lot of that can be traced to soldiers who were stationed here in World War II. They get sand in their shoes and wanted to come back to the state. And the state it's like we're this thing that just doesn't stop growing anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask you, and I think that you addressed this, but the sort of a chicken and egg situation with this myth and Florida tourism as being helpful. Did they think it was helpful because the myth existed, or did the myth get perpetuated because they wanted to promote Florida as helpful?
A lot of it has to do with, our assets here, sunshine and water. And I think those two are connected to health. In my latest book, I talk a lot about how water and health have been connected for years and years and years. So salt water was thought to be healthy. Spring water was thought to be healthy. We have 1,000 springs. So that's natural. But then the sunshine, in the 19th century, they started the Sanitarium Movement, which even up north, they wanted consumptives to go outside, as much as possible. Even if it was freezing, they wanted you to go outside. And Florida was perfectly positioned because you could be outside literally all year. And one of the things that I point out is the Sanitarium Movement eventually came to Florida, and that Advent Health was originally the Orlando Sanitarium, or the Florida Sanitarium, which took advantage of that. And people had hydrotherapy treatments and had that whole idea of being outside in the winter and being good for you. So I think the healthy thing would have been there without Ponce de León, but I think the two got married because he's the perfect vehicle. He's a personification of that whole idea, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, doesn't look like any additional questions came in, but I think that the reason for that may be because you covered the topic so thoroughly. I had several questions, and you kept answering my questions, and I was like, Rick. So I think we will go ahead and start wrapping up. I just want to let everybody know, I put the link to Rick's website in the chat. So if you're interested in this topic, he of course has the book about Ponce de León and the Fountain of Youth, and then he has the one that you can see on the poster behind him, Florida's Healing Waters. I do want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you, Rick, so much for facilitating our talk today. It's very interesting, and it's really nice to get that sort of, the story behind the story aspect and perspective. So thank you for that.
I would just like to add too that there are copies of my book at the gift shop at the History Center. So if you come out for Family Day, there's a few books there that you might want to get.
Absolutely. And so before we sign off here, on that note, Family Day is tomorrow. It is free. So it's a great time to come and have all of your family see our newest temporary exhibition, which has been extended through, it'll now be running through May 8th. It's called Giants, Dragons, and Unicorns, the World of Mythic Creatures, which is part of the reason why we had Rick come on here and talk about one of our most famous myths here in Florida. Even though it's not associated with a creature, but I guess depending on how you look at Ponce de León, I guess. Additionally, we have some great adult programming coming up. We have our series called Mythical Mornings, where it's kind of more of a fun, whimsical take on some of these mythical creatures. And you can enjoy some beverages and light brunch refreshments, and a specialized exhibition tour with one of our collection staff. So it's kind of a great way to get a deeper look at that exhibition and that content. So I would encourage everybody to check out our website. I will put a link to our events page in the chat again, just so you don't have to scroll back through to find it. Lots of great stuff coming up. So please do make sure to check all of that out. Thank you again, Rick, for facilitating our talk. Thank you everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy your weekend.